Welcome to Drive the Daf. Clear, structured explanation of the daily daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Yoma Daf Nun Aleph contains one Mishnah. The first part of the daf wraps up loose ends on three shilas we've been discussing about karbanos and whether they count as carbon yachid, individual carbon, or carbon tzibor, and that's relevant to whether you can bring them on Shabbos, whether you can bring them betumah, and whether they can do tumura. The Gemara will discuss these three shilas, resolve them, and then go to the Mishnah, which introduces the topic of when the Kohen Gadol walked across the Heichal to get to the Kodesh Kodashim. What route did he take? There are a number of routes he may choose. Which was the correct one? So first of all, we're discussing a number of shilas here. The first thing that we've been speaking about, which the Gemara wants to take care of, is the issue of what is an example of a carbon which is Doiche Shabbos and Tumah, means you could bring it on Shabbos, you could bring it if the congregation is Tameh, but it also makes Tumura. That is, if you have this animal that's set aside for the Kedusha of this carbon, and you say, I'm transferring the Kedusha onto a different animal, that animal gets Kedusha as well. This is problematic, because generally the type of carbon which can be brought on Shabbos and Batum is a carbon tzibor, a public carbon. But public carbon cannot make Tumura. So what type of animal are we talking about here? So the Gemara first tried to say that it's a par of Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur. The Gemara said there's alternatives to that. And Rav Sheshes had said it's the ayil, the special carbon ola of the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur. Now the Gemara says, well, there's a much simpler option. Well, we'll just talk about a carbon Pesach. Carbon Pesach, we know clearly you're allowed to bring it on Shabbos. You're allowed to bring it even if you're Tameh, as long as the row of the congregation is Tameh. And it's a private carbon, therefore it should be able to be brought, it should be able to make Tamura. If you try to switch the Kedusha off one animal to another, it should go. So Gemara says Rav Sheshes didn't want to say that option because Rav Sheshes holds like the opinion that says that a carbon Pesach has to have at least two people signed up to it. You have to have two partners. You cannot bring a carbon Pesach for one person. And therefore it has to be a partnership carbon. A partnership carbon can't make Tumura. Only an individually owned carbon can make Tumura. So Gemara says, well, what about Pesach Sheni? Pesach Sheni, he'll certainly agree any one person could bring that. Everybody holds that. So Gemara says that's true. Pesach Sheni could be a single individual. However, Pesach Sheni is not necessarily Doiche Tumah. You cannot bring Pesach Sheni necessarily when you're tummy. That's a machokis. And Rav Sheshes didn't want to get into that. The Gemara is going to quote this machokis next. But first the Gemara says, let's just resolve one other discussion over here, and that's in a previous Gemara we had been speaking about what is the rule for what type of carbon pushes off Shabbos and Tumah. You can bring it, but Tumah you can bring it on Shabbos. And Rav Yehuda had said there, he had distinguished between, he had spoken about examples of karbanos tzibor and karbanos yachid, and he called the carbon Pesach a carbon yachid, and he called the carbon chagiga, which is the carbon that's generally brought on Yontif, and a special one is brought along with the carbon Pesach. He called these karbanos tzibor. So Gemara says, how can you call a carbon Pesach a carbon yachid and a carbon chagiga a carbon tzibor? They're both karbanos brought by individual people for their Yontif observance. How are they different? The only way that you could view a carbon chagiga as a carbon tzibor is because it's brought to beknufya. It's brought when there's a lot of people, thousands of people bring carbon chagiga. They're all bringing individual ones, but they have a large group of people that are bringing them at the same time. So in that sense, it's a carbon tzibor. That's true for carbon Pesach also. So call a carbon Pesach carbon tzibor. How could Rav Yehuda say that a carbon Pesach is a carbon yachid and a carbon chagiga is a carbon tzibor? As Gemara says, the answer is where we were talking about Pesach Sheni. Pesach Sheni is not brought by large groups. It's only brought by the individuals who are tamei the first Pesach, and therefore a Pesach can come in a situation that's not in a large group, and therefore it'll just be called a carbon yachid, and therefore we refer to carbon Pesach as a carbon yachid. So Gemara says the problem here is that what Rav Yehuda had been saying was that a carbon Pesach is brought, it could be brought on Shabbos, and it could be brought betumah. But it's not necessarily true. If he was talking Pesach Sheni, that's not necessarily true that a carbon Pesach could be brought betumah. Is it true that a carbon Pesach could be brought betumah? So Gemara says yes, it's a machlokas about the subject, and he was referring to the opinion that says that it could be brought betumah, just like before we were referencing that opinion as well. And the Gemara now says, I'm going to spell out what this machlokas is. The Gemara introduces it. It's a brisa. It says a machlokas between Rabbi Yehuda and a Tanakama. We know that a carbon Pesach Sheni can be brought on Shabbos. The question is, could a carbon Pesach Sheni be brought betumah as well? Rabbi Yehuda says yes. Tanakama says no. The Gemara says, what's this machlokas about? The Gemara says, simple svara. The Chachamim say, how could you bring a Pesach Sheni B'tumah? The whole reason that you're bringing Pesach Sheni is because you didn't want to bring Pesach Rishon B'tumah. You couldn't bring the first Pesach because you were Tameh. So now we're going to say, we'll give you a second chance, and now you can bring it even if you're Tameh. That doesn't make any sense. If you bring it B'tumah, you could have brought Pesach Rishon B'tumah. That's the Chachamim svara. To that, Rabbi Yehuda says no. The Torah says clearly that you're allowed to keep all the halachos of a Pesach Rishon. Pesach Rishon could be brought b'tumah if most of the congregation is tamei. There are situations in which you could bring a carbon Pesach b'tumah. Well, Pesach Sheni has the same rules, and it could also be brought b'tumah. What the Torah means to tell you is that, listen, we're giving you two chances. Bring Pesach Rishon if you are tar. If you're not tar, let's try again. Try Pesach Sheni. If you're still not tar, so then what can we do? We tried all our options. We'll let you bring it b'tumah. Okay, now the Gemara refers back to a different suffix we had, a question that we had, and the Gemara says, why don't we resolve it from something? We had asked earlier, the shayla that started this whole thing was whether the power of the Kohen Gadol could make Tamur or not. Now, the power of the Kohen Gadol is meant to be mechaper. It brings kapara for the Kohen Gadol. It comes from his own money, and it also brings kapara for all the other Kohanim. The question had been, does it belong to other Kohanim? It comes from the Kohen Gadol's own money, but if it brings kapara for the other Kohanim, is that because it belongs to them? Or is it really the Kohen Gadol's own kapara and it just belongs to him, and they're kind of riding his coattails to kapara as well? If it belongs to them, then it can't make Tamura. It's a publicly owned or partnership owned carbon. If it belongs to the Kohen Gadol, then it could. If it's only his and they're riding on his coattails, then it could make Tamura. So the Gemara says there should be a simple resolution to this. The pasuk that describes the power of the Kohen Gadol calls it Asher Loi 3 times. It says Parachatas Asher Loi, Parachatas Asher Loi, Parachatas Asher Loi. 3 times it refers to it that way. These 3 drashas are to teach us that it's got to be from his own money. The first one is to teach that it cannot be from Klal Yisrael's money. Second one is to teach that it can't be from Kohanim's money. And the third one is to teach that if it is from Kohanim's money or anybody else's money, it's puzzle, even if you did it already. So it clearly can't be from anybody else's money. So how can you have a tzad? How can you even think that you can't bring Tamur because it's publicly owned? It's got to be his. The Torah stresses it 3 times. So Gemara says, but how do you understand how it brings kapara? How does it bring kapara for them if it's not theirs? Obviously, you have to agree that even though it's fully the Kohen Gadol's, but somehow the Torah gave them the ability to have enough of a piece in it that it gains kapara. So we also therefore have a question. Maybe if the Torah gave them a piece of it to the extent that it gives them a kapara, it also gave them a piece in it to the extent that they can't make Tamura because it belongs to them in some extent, and therefore the question is not resolved by that. Okay, now we get to the Mishnah. The Mishnah discusses how did the Kohen Gadol cross the Kodesh Kodashim. So for the Kodesh to get to the Kodesh Kodashim. So first let's get the layout of the Heichel in our mind. The Kodesh, he enters the door, which is on the west end, and he's standing in the large room. The Heichel is 20 amos wide. He enters in the center. He's got 20 amos on his left, 20 amos on his right. In front of him, directly in the center, is the Mizbeach, the golden Mizbeach Hazav. To the left of that, which is southward and slightly a little deeper in, is the Menorah. There's a small space between the Menorah and the south wall. And to the right of the Mizbeach, on the north of the Mizbeach, is the Shulchan, and that's also a little deeper in, and there is the Mizbeach to the, and the wall is probably a bit spaced further to the north of the Shulchan. Depends on which opinion we'll hold, like as we'll see soon. Now, he has to pass these kalim to get to the pareches. On the other side of the Heichel is the pareches, and there's a machlokes how the pareches was actually set up, and this Mishnah describes that machlokes. According to Rabbi Yossi, there was one pareches. It was complete, and it was pinned back so that he could walk through all the way on the northern end. There was a slightly space that's all the way to his right, all the way on the northern end. It was pinned back, and he could go through there. Now, the Chachamim agree that that's the inner pareches. They say, however, there was an additional outer pareches, meaning the pareches that gives access to the Kodesh Kodashim itself is definitely pinned back to allow entrance on the northern end. However, the Chachamim say there was an additional second pareches, 1 amma previous to that pareches, and that was pinned back all the way on the southern end. So when he's actually walking across the Heichel, he's aiming for the south end. So the Mishnah just says that he walked across the Heichel. Doesn't say how he got through it, and it brings the machlokes whether there was 1 pareches or 2 pareches there. Now the Chachamim say that there's got to be 1 pareches. The Torah, when it describes the building of the Mishkan, it says v'hivdi laha pareches lochem ben hakodesh v'ben kodesh haglashim. The pareches talks about 1 pareches. So Gemara starts now. The Gemara says, well, how could a Rashi say that there were 2? It was clearly 1. So Gemara says that the 3 versions of the Mikdash had 3 different things. In the Mishkan there was 1. As it says, clearly you're right, the pasuk that's being quoted, there was 1 in the Mishkan. However, when the Beis HaMikdash, the first Beis HaMikdash was built, that Mishkan, that pareches was replaced with a wall. The wall was called Amatraxin. It was 1 amma thick, and it stood the entire height of the Heichel, of the Kodesh and the Kodesh Kodashim, which was the pasuk describes the Heichel as being 30 amos tall and the Kodesh Kodashim as being 20 amos tall. It could be it was really 30, but from we start counting from higher up, but it was approximately a 30 amma height, and that was the height of this amma traxon, this 1 amma thick wall. The word traxon, Rashi explains elsewhere, is derived from a term that we don't know which part, whether it belonged to the inside or the outside. But that was in the first Beis Hamikdash. However, when they built the second Beis Hamikdash, they could not build it with a wall, and the reason is because the height of the second Beis Hamikdash went up to 40 amas, and a wall that was only 1 amma thick could not stand higher than 40 amas. The bricks were not cemented together; they stood by virtue of their weight, and a 40 amma wall, 1 amma thick, wouldn't last. And therefore, they could not have a wall there. They couldn't thicken the wall because there were specific measurements. They weren't allowed to make the wall thicker than that, so they had to replace it with a paroches. The problem was that the Chachamim at the time were not sure if the paroches was meant to be on the inside of the Amma or on the outside of the Amma. They weren't sure if that Amma was meant to be part of the Kodesh Kedoshim or if that Amma had the Kedusha of the Heichel. They knew that there was an Amma thick wall, but was it that thickness? Was that Kodesh Kedoshim, and therefore the Parochas should be pulled back to the outside of that Amma? Or was that Amma Kodesh, and therefore the Parochas should be pushed in past the Amma? And therefore they said we have to make 2 Parochas, and that's what they did, and that's how Rabbi Yossi explains his opinion. Now the Gemara gets deeper into how the Kohen crossed the Heichel exactly. The Gemara brings 3 opinions, and the Gemara is going to see how Rabbi Yossi fits into this. So, what route did he take to cross the Heichel? So the 3 opinions are as follows. Rabbi Yehuda says he went between the menorah and the mizbech. That's the mizbech was straight ahead of him. He moved slightly to his left, and he went slightly to his south, and he went between the menorah and the mizbech. Rabbi Meir says he went between the shulchan and the mizbech. That is, he circled the mizbech to the north. Now, there's a third opinion, which is Bryce. It doesn't say that. It says he actually went between the shulchan and the wall, all the way along the northern wall. The Gemara says that must be Rabbi Yossi, because Rabbi Yossi says that there was only 1 paroches. Means he was heading straight for the door, straight for the entrance, where the curtain was pinned back, which was all the way on the northern end. Since he was going to the northern end, he walked all the way along the north wall. So Gemara says, what do the other ones hold? So Gemara says, Rabbi Yehuda held like the Chachamim, and therefore he was heading for the south wall. There were 2 parochas, and therefore he had to head to the south wall because the outer one was pinned back all the way near the south wall, so he had to head south. Now he could have walked all the way along the south wall between the menorah and the wall, but then the smoke of the menorah, which was on the wall, there would have blackened his white clothing. In order to prevent that, he didn't go between the menorah and the wall. He went between the menorah and the mizbech slightly. He circled the menorah on the other side. He didn't have to rub against the wall. The question is, what does Rabbi Meir hold? Why does he go between the shulchan and the mizbech? Why does he circle the mizbech to the north? Well, who does he hold like? If he holds like Rabbi Yehuda, he should go all the way in the south. If he holds like the Chamim, who he said is Rabbi Yossi, he should go all the way to the north. So the Gemara says 2 explanations of what he potentially held. Either he held that he really held like Rabbi Yossi, and he's supposed to go all the way to the north. The problem was that he held that there was no space between the shulchan and the wall. And that's because Shalom HaMelech made 10 extra shulchanos, and he held that those 2 shulchanos were lined up in 2 rows, one next to the other, 2 rows of 5 each. Now, since the shulchan was 2 amas wide, if you put 5 next to each other, you have a total of 10 amas. The shulchan couldn't cross the center line. It had to all be in the northern half. That fills the entire space. Remember, the heichel was 20 amas wide, so half of it is 10 amas. That row of 5, and there were 2 rows of 5, filled the entire space from the wall to the center line. Therefore, he couldn't get around it to the north, and therefore he had to go around it to the south, and he had to go past the shulchan to the south and past the mizbeach to the north, and that's why he went between them like that. That's the first explanation. The second explanation is that he held, no, really those shulchanos were lined up not perpendicular to him in a row, but he walked alongside them. They weren't lined up in a way that blocked him. They were lined up along the north wall, and therefore he was able to walk past them. The problem was he held that it wasn't proper to walk straight looking into the Kodesh Kodashim the whole time. Again, he held like Rabbi Yossi. There was only 1 curtain, and it was pinned back, and if he's walking all along the north wall, he's walking straight in. That wasn't covered. However, Rabbi Yossi disagreed. Rabbi Yossi said, no, Klal Yisrael have a special schus. Klal Yisrael didn't even need a shliach. Their own tefillas count, and therefore the shliach is on a special high madrega, and he's allowed to walk that way, and that's not.
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.